Welcome to CHSF 2107, the coolest class online. This is the Social Emotional Development in Early Adulthood, Chapter 10. All right, so in this presentation, we're going to be looking a lot at this idea of intimacy and this idea of like how Erickson talked about how one of the key tasks that are placed on people at this age is sort of trying to figure out who you're going to be in your life. And you had kind of been working through some of that in the adolescent social emotional development in terms of identity, and now it's in terms of intimacy, in terms of who are you going to share your life with, whether we're talking about dating or marriage or just friendship level, or whether we're talking about work wise, or whether we're talking about kind of social engagement level, kids, right? So this whole idea about what's going to be the makeup of your social environment moving forward, and how do you form one that's healthy and psychologically fulfilling. Thanks for coming. Grab a nice warm drink and a comfy chair and a pen and paper, and you know how to be students. Love you. Catch you on the next slide. So one of the first ideas for today is this idea that one of the things that gives developmental psychology a lot of value and a lot of importance is this idea that things that happen early on and measurements that we take early on have predictive value later. And it's not that because this happened, this definitely will happen, but there's what we call correlation, right? That things seem to be associated, that the development and attachment patterns that are established early between the baby and mom shape things later. It shapes relationships later in life. For adults, social emotional development revolves around adaptively integrating our emotional experiences into enjoyable relationships on a daily basis. That wasn't a direct segue between what I was saying and that quote, but that's a pretty good quote. What I want to talk about here is this attachment styles, right? I should have said the quote first and then got into the attachment piece, but that's actually a pretty good one, right? Like, what is you having a good relationship with your boyfriend or girlfriend? Adaptively integrating your emotional experiences into enjoyable relationships. And it's not just that, obviously. It's not just about that. But you could almost look at it as there's like sort of your mental health and your partner's mental health and your relationship's mental health. And those are almost three interrelated things. Or the three layers of analysis, I should say. Right, and that this idea in developmental psych is that the first 20 years of life or so lay a lot of the foundational groundwork for the social and emotional development that's coming later. And I want to kind of focus on these three attachment styles, right? So we see that when, and again, this is sort of why I started with that rant, is because like if the attachment studies that we did on kids and we said, okay, so some kids have this kind of attachment, some this and some this, and then we look at people when they're adults and we look at their ability to have high quality relationships and there's no relationship between those two, well then attachment psychometrics are less important. But if we see that there is this dramatic connection, then there's something there, right? Like Erickson was on to something, that the quality of our early emotional experiences is related to things later. Securely attached adults tend to have a more positive view of relationships, tend to find it easier to get close to others, tend to be less concerned or stressed out with their romantic relationships. They tend to enjoy sexuality in the context of committed relationships that are less likely to have like kind of one night stands. And again, like I'm a 40-year-old talking to a bunch of younger people about this, and I want to try to make the point that like it's such a countercultural message to even say things like, you know, you might be happier with long-term stable relationships. It's like weird. It's interesting that seems almost like controversial to say when it's logically, developmentally, evolutionarily, biologically, emotionally kind of obvious. And again, I'm trying to say this from a psychology perspective, not a morality perspective. But what it's saying is like, it's actually super deep, right? Because it's saying like if people didn't have that depth of attachment early. It's hard to have it later. And if they did have it, it's easier to replicate that pattern later. It's a style. It's not a diagnosis. And this is an important concept, right? That the word style is a hugely important word here, because some of you might have heard what I just said and thought, well, what if in my life I didn't have the greatest attachment? Does that mean I'll never have solid relationship? And the answer to that would be no. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. It means you might have to work harder at processing some of the emotions attached to that, what Erickson would call developmental dilemma. When kids score as more avoidant, when they're adults, they tend to be more hesitant about getting involved in romantic relationships, so more issues around commitment and stuff like that. Which is so fascinating, right? That's basically what we mean when we say that people have trust issues. And you've maybe heard me say that right at the beginning of the course, where I mentioned that like Erickson kind of has this idea that, well, doesn't kind of have this idea, it's a central concept, that like that our mind forms through interaction with our social world, psychosocial. And so that these early things, right? So like this early inability to establish the idea that the world that you live in is safe and that you can trust its safety actually can make us less likely to trust later as adults, even if we couldn't articulate any connection there. Right? It's not, and again, that's an important point, and I think you all know that at this point, but like, I'll just say it one last time, is like, obviously they're not articulating these people in their heads. They're not saying like, because this, I'm gonna act like this. It's happening at more of a energetic level, I guess, or psychological level, deep psychological level. And then the more anxious attachment style, or the more disorganized. So in this scenario, there's a lot of both clinging and lack of trust. And so both of those at the same time. So it's like this desire to always be with the person, but also not really trusting, and really being nervous when the person's not there. And these individuals demand closeness, are less trusting, are more emotional, jealous, possessive. And it makes sense developmentally. In a retrospective study, Cindy Hazens and Philip Shaver in 1987 revealed that young adults who were securely attached in their romantic relationships were more likely to describe their early relationships with their parents as securely attached. In a longitudinal study, infants who were securely attached at age 1 were securely attached 20 years later in their adult relationships. And that's research from Steele, with an E at the end, 1998. Another longitudinal study revealed that securely attached infants were in more stable romantic relationships in adulthood than securely attached counterparts, right? So securely attached infants were in more stable relationships than insecurely attached counterparts, right? So then kids that were, the psychomeasurement was insecure as kids. That's from Salvador, 2011. Yet another longitudinal study found that insecure avoidant attachment at 8 years was linked to lower levels of social initiative, and prosocial behavior. So lower levels, so avoidant attachment linked to lower levels of prosocial behavior, higher levels of social anxiety, higher levels of loneliness at age 21. I stumbled with that sentence, and I'm 8 minutes into this slide. So instead of redoing the slide, I'm just gonna, if you just allow me to just say that last sentence over, because there's a lot in there, and I started kind of making sure I was saying the right thing while I was reading it, and I messed up. So I'm just gonna do it again. Yet another longitudinal, so again, longitudinal just means a study that's done multiple times. You might know this, right? So a what's the opposite of longitudinal? I'm forgetting the second part of the word, but basically there's like two types of ways you can do research with people. You can either like ask them on the spot and they can answer, and it's kind of a snapshot of right now, or you can ask them over periods of time, right? So I can, like, this is what attachment research is, right? Where they get a score on someone early and then check back several times throughout the process. Semisectional, it doesn't matter. I'm going to let that go. I forget what that's called, but okay, so back to what I was saying. Yet another longitudinal study found that insecure avoidant attachment at 8 years of age was linked with lower levels of social initiative, lower pro-social behavior, higher levels of social anxiety, and higher levels of loneliness at 21 years of age. Right, so this whole slide's looking at this idea of stability and change, that, like, it's sort of interesting that there's this ability to see a connection between early attachment and basically dating behavior, relationship behavior as adults. Okay, so in psychology there's a thing called psychometrics, and I'm sure you've heard of it, and all it means is, just think of what metrics means. Metrics means to measure and then, or to attach numerical scores, so to give things a number. And then psycho is like the beginning of the word psychology, so psychometrics is like any kind of thing that you take that's like a scale or a test or something that gives you some kind of score. You're this much this, you're this much that. IQ is like the best example, right? So IQ is like the most well-known one. It's the most valid and reliable. At Stanford, all the first-year students every year do it. The Stanford-Binet IQ test is, when I say most valid and reliable, I mean it's, in research context, what that means is that those have been done over and over and over and over and over and over and over with different people from different backgrounds at different ages, and shown consistency, that not that the test is perfect, but that they're measuring what they're saying they're measuring. That's what valid and reliable means. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best measure of intelligence ever, but it means that it's saying that it's measuring these things, and it actually is. So, and again, this is kind of complicated without getting into stats, but in stats what that's called is factor analysis. So it's basically called, like, and I'll show you on the next slide. I almost skipped ahead, but then I forgot I'm recording this and not talking live, and that would have messed this up. But the next slide, you'll see what factor analysis is, where it's like, okay, well, all these things, I could ask you a question about how happy you are, and then I could ask you a question about how much positive emotion you have, and then I could ask you a question on how much you smile, and then I could ask you a question about how much during the day you find yourself, whatever, reflecting positively. And then I could, like, ask all these questions and realize I'm really just asking, like, how much positive emotion you have, and I could really kind of zero it all down to just one question instead of 8. And so I can ask with that one question, I can basically predict what you would have said on those other 8, so I can just ask with the one. And so that was my quick freestyle attempt to explain what factor analysis means. But it basically means, if we want to say what personality is, and we're like, okay, well, it's all these different things. And how they actually originally did it was, they basically looked for all the examples in the English language of where we had words that represented emotions. And then they started to kind of create charts and realize when we're actually talking about the same thing, right? Like maybe joy and happiness and I almost said enthusiasm, but that's more like inspiration. Joy and happiness and contentment, and some of these things that we would label as emotions are sort of all sort of the same, right? And you start to put them into categories, and you realize, like, actually you can bring it all the way down to 5. There's really 5, the big 5. This is why it's called 5-factor analysis, that really you can define personality by 5 main scores. If I can know your score on openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, that spectrum, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is now tends to be called emotional stability, but in the original literature it was called neuroticism, because that used to not be a word, because that's the right word in the context of psychology, but it means something else in broader society, and so it sounds more negative because of what it means in broader society, so they've kind of changed the word. Just to go on a big rant there. Right, because people don't want to hear that they have a high score in neuroticism, because now people use that word more generally to just mean, well, whatever it means kind of in pop culture. So now it tends to be called emotional stability. And so this major study of adult personality development continues to be conducted by the research of mainly Paul Costa and Robert McCrae, and then, like, kind of their team of students. So I'll read this to you. Using a 5-factor personality test, Costa and McRae studied approximately 1,000 college-educated men and women aged 20 to 96, assessing the same individual over many years. Data collection began in the 1950s to mid-60s, depending on the person. Costa and McRae concluded that considerable stability exists across the adult years on the 5 personality factors. Okay, so I'm just going to go through kind of like an interesting point on each of these. Hang on one sec. Okay. So the first one, openness to experience. So think about this. So this is just like a image on the slide that I got off the internet, but sometimes it's often presented as ocean just because it's easier to remember, right, as an acronym or whatever. So openness to experience. Individuals high in openness to experience are more likely to score high in cognitive functioning, achievement, and IQ across the lifespan. It's actually like there is a bit of a link between the score on O and IQ. Tend to be more creative, experience less negative affect and stress. Again, tends to be is associated. Individuals high in conscientiousness tend to actually have better health and less stress, engage in superior problem solving and focused coping, are more successful at accomplishing goals, tend to have less cognitive decline as they age. That's pretty interesting too. Extroversion. Individuals high in extroversion are more likely than others to be satisfied in their relationship. Right, so they're more likely to report satisfied relationships, so less negative reaction to stress, have more positive sense of well-being. People who are, I'm just being self-conscious that I'm sort of presenting it as like one's good, one's bad, and I don't really mean to it, because conscientiousness can also be a problem, right? Because if you are super high in conscientiousness and you're following all the rules, it's like you're basically like a puppet. And it's like, but if you don't follow it all, it's like you're impossible to work with. And like openness, if you're like so open to it, it's like, it was an Einstein that said like have like an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. It's like, that's like an awesome quote, or he said it better, but something like that. And then it's like extroversion, introversion. It's like some of the most successful and creative people in the world are introverts. So it's like I'm kind of making a generalized comparison, but yeah, like extroversion, right? If you really thrive off emotional, social interaction, it sort of makes sense that like, well, that you just, I don't know, maybe enjoy relationships more. It's like, but maybe not, because again, that's such a tough thing, because what does enjoy relationships more mean? We'd have to factor analysis what that means. Okay, Mike, rant much, finish your slide. Okay, here we go. So people who are high in agreeableness are more likely to be generous or altruistic, tend to have more satisfying romantic relationships, tend to engage in more positive emotion towards stressors. Right? So you want on a work site sort of, or kind of a combination, and here's the thing, right? It's like people aren't one or the other, right? These are all spectrums where it's like a range of scores. Being agreeable is good, but not, again, it's sort of like what I was saying earlier about conscientiousness. It's like these things can become problematic at extremes, because you don't want to be so agreeable that you're never sticking up for yourself and just doing what you're told constantly, even when it doesn't make sense. And then neuroticism. People high in neuroticism, or sorry, emotional stability is sort of the more common word now, but my old notes, it still says neuroticism, are more likely to have issues with substances, more likely to have issues with heart issues, lower sense of self well-being. And that shouldn't really be surprising, right? So if emotional stability is defined as this tendency towards more negative emotionality, like more negative emotions, more constant worry, all this kind of stuff, especially in men, that's big time related to heart disease and heart attacks, which is a huge risk for men. Heart problems are a risk for everyone, but it's statistically way more for men. Right? And the tendency to numb it. So Big Five, the thing that's interesting with Big Five is it's actually like it's not like a diagnosis, right? So it's not like you would do it and then it's like, oh, this is what I am, and this is, now I have to see myself through this. It's like, no, but what it would be interesting if you're dating someone, if you're in like a long-term relationship with someone and you want to, have your life together, and you're really interested in them, it'd be fascinating for you two to sit down, and it wouldn't take a long time. You could probably find it online for free, and if you're interested, I could probably find it for you, and just do the personality test, and you would understand the other person way more. It's like me and my wife, it's like we score different on extroversion. She would way rather on a day like today. This is a perfect example. Like today she's over at her sister's house with the two kids, and like on a Sunday off, and I'm like, and she's totally happy. That's totally what she wants to do. That's totally her thing. And it's like, for me, I'm like, yes, that means like some time in the office by myself to get caught up on work and like, relax a bit maybe after and stuff. And it's like, because that's how I recharged for Monday that starts tomorrow, right? And it's like, and then all of a sudden you don't have to bang heads about it, because you realize how to what do you realize? I don't know, that you just understand them better, and you just realize that you're both just trying to do your best, and you both have different ways that you try to reset, especially if we're talking about the extroversion introversion variable. All right, next slide. So I just wanted to show this quick because I thought you might find it interesting, and this is like looking a little bit at how this factor analysis works and how people have the different scores on this and kind of the different profiles, right? So for example, if you look at agreeableness or openness or extroversion or any of the different ones, you see that there's kind of like sub questions within. So then if you were going to actually say like, okay, well, what's in the test? It's like, okay, well, the test is basically 5 areas, or the multiple, or the big 5 personality quiz, or assessment, or whatever you want to call it, right? So it's basically these 5 areas, and each of those areas basically have these 6 sub areas, and each of those 6 sub areas kind of focus on an aspect of the broader concept, right? And so maybe you have like 2 questions for each of the 6 for all of them, and that's basically your scale. Again, that's like kind of simple, just trying to explain it, but it's like that's sort of how you do what they call like scale construction or quantitative research. Yes, scale design. I took an awesome class on quantitative research, which I didn't think I would like, but I had to in my PhD program at Waterloo, and I had a teacher named Brian Smale who was amazing and actually made me like stats. I went from like thinking I was going to really not like the class to just really learning how to read stats, and then all of a sudden it's like, it's just, I don't know, you just realize it's just like a specific language, and once you learn the language, it's actually pretty straightforward compared to a lot of other types of math that's like much more abstract. Okay, next slide. Now, I do want to bring up this topic of marriage, and what's sort of interesting about this is like, again, the marriage piece. We treat people differently when we're in our mind planning on being with that person for a long time. And I think that's one of the most important lessons for this stage of development from developmental psychology. If you plan to be with someone for a long period of time, you behave differently towards them. And I'll kind of explain what I'm meaning over these next few slides. So it's interesting, right? Because if you watch like popular TV or whatever, you'll hear people be like, oh yeah, like half of marriages end in divorce, blah, blah, blah. Did you hear this, that? You hear this, that? And it's like, okay, but again, we were just talking about stats. If you look at the statistics, it's actually really shocking, because what you find is that almost the vast majority of marriages that fall apart, it's within the first year or 2. And of course, some marriages fall apart after long periods of time. But what is interesting is that once you pass on, like, so if you were to graph it, once you pass year 8, the likelihood of the marriage ending in a divorce drops below 0. or drops to nearly zero. Sorry, I shouldn't say below zero. Obviously, it doesn't drop below zero, but it drops below 1%, I meant to say, to nearly zero statistically. Now remember, obviously it still happens, but if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions of people that are married in Canada, I don't know, at the very least hundreds of thousands, probably millions, right? You could still have thousands and thousands of people getting divorced after 8 years and it'd still be less than 1%. So that's a again, if I freestyled that math wrong, please forgive me, but I think I did it right. But the math is less important than this idea that once you get past 8 years, the probability of divorce drops like massively significantly, and that should actually be encouraging for people, and because it's sort of saying like, yeah, it's difficult. Relationships are difficult. If you're like dating now, you know that relationships are difficult. It's not like marriage isn't difficult, but once you sort of figure out each other and over time establish a pattern of behavior that sort of supports each other but allows each other to be their own self, and you sort of figure out how to live together, and that actually adds stability. And so you don't have to be jaded about the concept, right? And again, this is I'm using the example of marriage, and the research is specifically on marriage, but I would make an argument that it's true dating wise too. It's like, and you know it, you already know it. It's like if you're dating someone that you think is just like, you're just having fun and it's just kind of, you're seeing where it's going, your whole psychology around that person is different than if you're with this person and you feel like you and the other person are both committed to each other long term. It's just a different psychology. And the psychology, and so the point I'm trying to make is like the legal marriage piece, I think, is a little bit less key to this than the psychology of being committed to the person long term. That is a different experience than not being in that psychology, because you act differently. And when I'm saying it's different, what I mean is it's different in how it affects the relationship between it and your behavior is different. It's different. No, this is how I should say it. Sorry, I'm kind of free flowing here. It's different in how it's expressed in your behavior. How you value the commitment in a specific relationship gets expressed through your behavior. Would be a lesson from developmental psychology. And the statistical evidence is crystal clear that married adults tend to have happier, longer, healthier lives, lower risks of psychiatric disturbance. And again, please keep in mind, a lot of the developmental psychology research had occurred half a generation at least ago, so it's a lot of it is I don't even know if I need to add that qualifier. It's like there's so much pressure in culture right now, and in academia and everything, to tell everyone that everything is just whatever you want to do. But honestly, it's like, I don't care if you get married or not, or date or not, but what I am giving as advice is the quality of the commitment and the quality of if you actually care affects your psychology, and it affects your behavior, and it affects therefore the relationship. It's a tough thing to talk about, right? Because it's like I'm trying really hard to like report on what psychology says and not get preachy, and also care about you, and the fact that I'm like, I've just seen it in the people I know. It's like if you care about your relationships, it's different than if you don't. So I want to present this to you, and I think you might find this kind of neat. So this is Gottman's work, and he's looking at this idea of advice for successful marriages. And again, I want to kind of make this point, but not have to make this point every slide, that a lot of the research and even the textbook is talking about marriage. And I want to kind of step back and make the point that, like, obviously this is also talking about committed long-term relationships that don't, like, whether the state recognizes it or not, it isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the depth of the psychological relationship. So Gottman's first principle. Establish this idea of love maps was his suggestion, and he said that individuals in successful marriages have personal insights and a kind of detailed map of each other's life and world. They aren't psychological strangers. In good marriages, partners are willing to share their feelings with each other. They use these love maps, right? So kind of like my understanding of my wife's understanding of things, but from a positive perspective of like, I know what bugs her, I know what makes her feel supported. Use these love maps to express not only your understanding of each other, but also fondness and admiration, right? So anyways, if you wanted to find something interesting and you wanted to add that to your relationship, I would just suggest just Google Gottman and love maps, or you probably just understood it from what I just said. It's like basically the more you know the terrain of their psychology around the relationship, the more you can feed positivity and meaning into that. Right, so Gottman studied all these people that were married, and he started to focus kind of more specifically on the people that had good marriages, or what they would themselves call good marriages. And then he asked them, well, like, what are you doing? Can you tell the rest of us? Right, and one of the things that he kind of came to is like people said it in their own ways, but basically it's like it's a very individualized thing. It's the if you wanted to use phenomenology, there's this word intersubjectivity, but it basically means like this shared, part of it's cognitive, part of it's emotional, part of it's relational, whatever. This shared love map is his word. Okay, second one, nurturing fondness and admiration. In successful marriages, partners sing each other's praises. More than 90% of the time when couples put a positive spin on their marriage history, the marriage is likely to have a positive future. I'll read that again, and then I'll give a disclaimer. More than 90% of the time when a couple puts a positive spin on their marriage's history, the marriage is likely to have a positive future. And I have written in bold underneath, remember that positive spin is different than accepted delusion. And what I mean by that is, so I don't mean say that the relationship is full of abuse and you just kind of pretend that you focus on just the positive, that you have fun together, that's going to make it good long term. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that because again, I'm making the point that would be more close to delusional. There's in any relationship, there's going to be things that are good and bad, and it's like, what are you focusing on when you're thinking of the story of your relationship? Like, is it the 6 big fights you had, or is it the 5 good years? Right? And it's like how you respond to that matters. Okay, turning towards instead of away. The best way that you can tell when things are getting bad in relationships is when the couples in the relationship stop making eye contact. Right? You can actually, they've done studies where they can predict long-term relationship stability by like the amount of eye contact of people that when you're not even listening to the words they're saying. I should try to look up those studies, because I remember learning about that in like a social psych class like way back. And they actually did it with doctors too, and they could I'm going to tell this from memory, so I apologize if I get a couple details wrong, but basically what they did is they were looking at, can you tell what doctors are more likely to get sued? And this is in the States where you can sue doctors. Can you tell what doctors are more likely to get sued by how their interaction with their patients go? And so they would film it, and they started to realize they could predict who was more likely. And then what was interesting is in the experiment, the next round, they said, okay, what if we turn off the sound and we don't even hear what they're saying? And they found they could still predict pretty good. And then they said, well, what if we only, instead of watching the whole interaction, what if we only can watch 30 seconds with no sound? And they found they could still predict at an impressive level. And because it was almost all related to nonverbal attentive behavior. How the doctor positioned, did the doctor actually look and stop and make eye contact when the person was first telling their problem? It was like these little things, this little turning toward rather than away, that actually affects us at this like maybe even hard to kind of process and compute interpersonal level. Good marriages, spouses are adapt or trained at, or not trained, but good at turning towards each other regularly. They see each other as friends. This friendship doesn't keep arguments from occurring, but it can prevent differences from overwhelming the relationship. I'm going to say that again. This friendship basis doesn't keep arguments from occurring, but it can prevent differences from overwhelming the relationship. In good marriages, spouses respect each other and appreciate each other's point of view despite disagreements. Again, please try to keep in mind that although this sounds preachy, Gottman's not being preachy. What he's doing is actually interviewing thousands of couples and finding the ones that report the highest levels of long-term marital kind of engagement and satisfaction and commitment, and then trying to see what's common amongst them. Letting your partner influence you, and this sounds like we're supposed to be independent and stuff, and it's like, yeah, but if you're in a long-term relationship with somebody that you care about and who has your best interest in heart and you have their best interest in heart, you're going to shape each other a bit. The more open partners are to each other's ideas and choices, the more likely they are to respect and learn from each other. This in turn increases the chances that they'll achieve a cohesive union based on their differences as well as their similarities. And then the last one. This is the most important one in a certain level. The more partners can speak candidly and respectfully with each other, the more likely they are to create shared meaning in their marriage. Right? Like what the shared meaning, like that what matters to me matters to my wife. Whether we're talking about like raising our kids, whether we're talking about faith, whether we're talking about family values, whatever it is, right? That we have things that have shared meaning to us. So Gottman said that like this also includes sharing goals with one's spouse and working together to achieve each other's goals and stuff like that. And that all this is basically Gottman trying to say, like, if developmental psych could kind of give advice to the next generation around how to build healthy long-term relationships, it would be kind of these 5 things. Care about and understand the psychology of the other person to the depth that you can add meaning and value and appreciation into that. Actually develop the ability to be fond, to actually like enjoy the presence and kind of admire parts of the other person. It doesn't mean you have to worship them. Of course, everyone has things they're working on, right? But resisting the urge to be jaded and only focus on the negative. And again, I gotta take my own advice on that sometimes too, and like turning towards each other instead of away, and letting your partner influence you, and creating shared meaning, and that these are all kind of key to having, well, answering this broader question of how do we establish the intimacy that Erickson is warning us that if we don't establish during this period of life, we may experience psychological isolation.
I would say love is something everybody talks about, and the need for love is one of the most basic needs of man, namely the experience of union with another being, of becoming one with another being. And yet I would say that love today is a relatively rare phenomenon, that we have a great deal of sentimentality, we have a great deal of illusion about love, namely as something one falls in, but the question is that one cannot fall in love really. One has to be in love, and that means that loving becomes, and the ability to love, becomes one of the most important things in life.
Why is it so difficult for us to be in love as human beings? What is wrong with us, as you see it?
Because we are concerned with things, we are concerned with success, we are concerned with money, we are concerned with instrumentalities. And the most important things we talk about on Sundays are things to which we pay very little attention. Love is not easy. All great religions postulate love as one of the greatest accomplishments. If it were that easy, or as easy as most people think, certainly the great religious leaders would have been rather naive.
In a provocative book titled Marriage, A History, How Love Conquered Marriage, Stephanie Kuntz concluded that marriages in America today are fragile not because we have become self-centered and career-minded, but because expectations for marriage have become unrealistically high compared with previous generations. To make marriage work, Kuntz, like Gottman, emphasizes that partners need to develop a deep friendship, show respect for each other, and embrace commitment. Okay, so I want to kind of just go over some of the ideas presented in the textbook around some of the influences on marital success and just kind of talk about them more generally. So if you look at this first one, values, and this maybe makes complete sense, right? That like a core part of whether a relationship will work over the long term is kind of core values. And notice that's not interests, right? Because like, I'll use my example. I've been married 8 years now. It's not like me and my wife have the same interests in everything, right? Like she's watching like some show called Newsroom or something. I like watching the Raptors games. It's nice having two TVs sometimes, but it's like a lot of our values are the same, but that doesn't mean we're the same about everything, but we're the same at how we view raising our kids and like some of these kind of core things, and that's kind of more important, it seems, as a variable for how long and how successful the relationship will be than actually being the same interest in everything, because it's actually kind of nice to have different interests and be able to, still be your own person within the relationship. If there's really high levels of neuroticism, or what we called on the earlier slide, emotional stability, and that sort of makes sense, right? Like, so if one person in the relationship has way more negative emotionality than the other, that can become a drag on the relationship over time. I don't think that'll be too surprising for anyone to hear. Here's an interesting one: attitudes towards divorce. So when people are in a relation or get married and they're asked like, how do you view divorce in terms of like how negative they view it, the groups that view it less negative are actually statistically more likely to get divorced, which is really interesting, and actually more likely to report dissatisfaction with their marriage, which is quite interesting. That it's like almost the idea is almost that if you could read into this as almost inferring that if you have kind of if you think an exit strategy is something that's still in the cards, then you tend to experience your relationship as less enjoyable. And then another major influence is those attachment patterns that each individual person in the relationship has with family of origin. So, yeah, I'm recording this slide significantly later in the day than the slides before it. It's been a tough few days, eh? Okay, so it feels almost difficult to present a slide on love today, and yet it's so important, and there's so much division right now. Again, like obviously I could talk about romantic love and give easy examples and just breeze through the slide. This is a difficult time. And whether we're looking at this poisonous social media, whether we're looking at spun media, whether we're talking about the isolation people have been experiencing, whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about broken and interfered with development, whether we're talking about just not being able to say what you mean, right? And it's like, if you're really asking what is love, it's this like complex aspect of human behavior. It's not just romance, right? Because obviously, like, I can love my wife, but I also love my kids, and I love my family, and students. And when I say that, it sounds weird. I know it sounds weird, but it's like, but no, it's not weird, because my students are represented in a certain way in my mental world, and it's a positive way, and it's a meaning providing way, and it's an aspect that I care about and want to try to nurture however I can, right? And so I guess I'd be like affection, but see, like, it's, I wouldn't say like I have affectionate love for my students. That's not how I would ever say it. It's like, I don't know, I just have maybe hope for you. So maybe I should just switch from talking about that to give a better definition here. So what we're going to be talking about here is, if we look at love as referring to this kind of vast, complex aspect of our life and of our behavior, that spanning the range of relationships, that includes things like intimacy and our friendships and our romantic partners, and affectionate and consummate love. Consummate meaning like complete, and I'll explain that in a sec. But it's like self-disclosure, and maybe that's another thing. It's like, this microphone's a good listener. It's like I'm talking for hours and hours and hours and hours into the mic, and it's like, then it's such a blessing when you do your projects and stuff and I hear back, and it's like, whoa. It's because I know, like, obviously I know that you're students and real people and doing the class, but it is this weird thing of teaching remotely, right? That feedback is just so cool. And so there's an element of this like self-disclosure even in this relationship, right? Like, I'm constantly telling deep thing, or not necessarily deep, but like personal things about myself, because I always thought that mattered. I always thought that, like, the person speaking the words matters, or writing the words, because everyone can, I don't know, it's just, the messenger matters. And then we have this whole generation now of teenagers that have had, you know, to use the most general word, altered developmental paths in terms of like, just think about it, and some of you don't have to think that hard about visualizing it, right? Like if you were 18 when this started and now you're like 20, 21 almost, and it's like during this period that's supposed to be very focused on kind of developing your identity through your engagement with your social world and through your development of intimacy and all these things. Like, and so that's why I want to say, if this is speaking to any of you, like, be gentle with yourself. Things will stabilize. Right? So this idea of trying to manage the demands of intimacy and identity and independence becomes a major task of adulthood. So sorry, I'll tighten up a bit. I kind of got a little bit free flowing on that last slide, and I think I had just kind of like had a bit of a gap between recording, and I just sort of started to record and just started kind of talking on how I was feeling at the second, and then tried to link it with the point, and I think it worked okay. But I know there's a big pause at the beginning, and it's because I was considering like stopping and restarting, and then I thought, like, I think I don't know, I think there's some value in us seeing that each other are struggling, but not in a complaining way, in like a way of like normalizing it and being like, if you're just having trouble making sense of things right now, it's like you're not the only one, and it's not anything wrong with you. It's a difficult situation, and giving people the benefit of the doubt and not having to play politics like it's team sports, I think is really important for everybody. But again, I'm not here to be preachy, so I'm going to keep going here. The idea is that Sternberg presents his concept of consummate love, and consummate love to Sternberg is basically just this idea that real quality relationships are sort of characterized by these three things. Passion, so this is going to include, and I'll give you a slide in a second that has like some stuff, specific notes you can take, but passion regards obviously like the physical piece and the physical attraction and the sexual attraction, and then also the yearning to be with the person when you're not with them, right? And then there's the intimacy, right? So like the depth of the quality of the interaction. There's like a physical intimacy piece and an emotional intimacy piece, and also sort of like a, I don't know if the literature would have this name this way, but you can almost say like a cognitive intimacy, like the free-flowingness of discussion and the amount of honesty and stuff like that. And then the third variable is what he called commitment, right? So the desire of both people for it to be a long-term thing, how much they're invested, those kind of considerations. And that Sternberg thought that what was true love, or what he called consummate complete love, was a combination of those three things. So when you had the intimacy and the passion and the commitment together, and that other types of love, as you can see how he kind of labeled, there's other types of relationships that can be characterized with different words, right? Like companion love, if you have commitment and intimacy but without the passion, or romantic love if you have the intimacy and the passion without the commitment. But see how all the ones except the middle ones are just incomplete versions of the middle one. So with the slide before here, I kind of verbally explain this, but you can see this with this picture pretty clear. And I like this picture because someone took his theory and basically made it in a model, and kind of, as you can see, kind of like filled in the words for how the different combinations and stuff like that, right? So if there's just passion, it's infatuation. If it's just liking or just intimacy, it's liking. And you can see how like companion love and romantic love and fascist love is like facious love, or like fake love or hollow love. It's all like included there. So Sternberg was really interested in like what gives relationships quality and what emotional affection contributes to this, right? Like what is the kind of emotional felt experience of being in a successful quality long-term relationship. And as I was kind of mentioning in the last slide there, it's like he thought that intimacy, or these feelings that promote closeness and connectedness, right? So just think about this. If on the test, say for example, I was to give you an example and ask you how you would classify it, it's like basically how it scores on these three variables, right? Do you see intimacy, or this kind of emotional closeness and connectedness? Do you see passion, which is sort of this like longing to be together plus the sexual attraction piece? And then do you see the commitment, which is basically this, well, you know what commitment means, but it's this kind of shared vision towards a long-term goal of being together, right? It's like a commitment in each other, specifically as a pair. So then, just so you have this for your notes here, I want to have that when we're talking here about oh, the picture went away, but I liked it because it was like an older couple sitting there just like kind of looking back over things, and it's like, I don't know, you hear this as like a theme in movies and stuff, that like having someone to grow old with, and in some ways it's like if you find that, it's like, you know, it's one of the greatest gifts of life. And it's like one of the things is one of the reasons of teaching or learning about this stuff is because no relationships are perfect, and all relationships can get stronger in different areas. And maybe if we spend some time talking, like almost like Plato, spending time talking about what an ideal would be, or what a full expression of something would be, can then give us targets for improvement. And so like if and this is sometimes a problem, like if like in a relationship that marriage has been 8 years or whatever, is like, how do you keep it fresh? And you know, like the physical component of that is significant, and so it needs to be worked at in the same way as like maintaining intimacy and this emotional closeness. And especially in times when people are stressed and upset, it's like amazing what like a couple close people to you can do to buffer the stresses of our social experience and just our world. And then this idea of yeah, that's an interesting way of saying it, right? Looking at commitment as your cognitive appraisal of the relationship. It's a really weird way of saying it, but it's like what you think about when you think about the relationship. Like, do you think about this relationship as something that is like, do you have intent to maintain it even in the face of problems? Or, you know, I always use the example because some students find it kind of funny of like on the show Friends, when, because my wife watches it on repeat basically, but it's like when Chandler, and it's a good show, when Chandler and Monica are in like a fight, and Chandler thinks that they've broken up just because they got an argument, and Monica's like, no, like couples fight, welcome to an adult relationship. And it's just kind of a funny scene because she does it much fun, Courtney Cox does it in a much funnier way, but basically hits on this point of like, no, like it's like every couple has arguments. It's kind of how you deal with it and how you argue and how you maintain each other's value throughout arguments is a key value, or a key factor. So Sternberg thought that this could play out in other ways, right? That like obviously not all relationships are like kind of ideal, consummate, and consummate meaning like this, like full, right? Complete with no pieces missing. And it's like, well, oftentimes we're in situations where it's not that. Like, so maybe these are some examples I'd like you to have in your notes, please. So like infatuated, or this scenario, and you've heard people say this before, right? It's like somebody that you have like a massive, like, let me just use common language, like a massive crush on, right? What's that mean? It means like, well, maybe you're thinking about them all the time, you want to be with them all the time, maybe in your mind you're like committed to them, but notice how like the intimacy is not there, and not even the commitment really technically, right? So infatuation is really focused on this like psychological attachment and physical attraction. Then you have like the affectionate or more emotional love, and this could be a relationship where, for example, it's like, and this happens, and it's normal that this happens, and it's understandable that like for whatever reason the relationship just sort of lacks the passion aspect, but the people are really close emotionally and maybe even stay together because of that, because they're such good friends and because it works and because they're committed, right? So then if you're like, okay, well, what do you say to that? So if you were being like a marriage therapist, or if you were just that couple who was very self-reflective and aware and able to address that, what you would want to do is try to do things to add spark into the relationship, right? So address the part that's lacking. Infatuous love, or like passion, commitment, not presence, but the intimacy is. Again, like I should acknowledge that I understand that not all relationships are aimed at developing into consummate love, right? Like maybe it's a fling, maybe it's just like casual or whatever. And so in those scenarios, my theory that I'm presenting here falls apart a little bit, right? So this theory is almost taking as a preposition, like as an assumption, that you want a long-term relationship with a single person that's characterized by emotional depth, passion, and intimacy, right? So it's definitely making certain base assumptions. So here's like kind of another idea, and sometimes I just it might look a bit nicer if I was kind of going point by point, but just because these are huge PowerPoint files, and it really messes it up if you, and this is just a little pointer for you too. So see how I have this slide? Like say if I made the top points and I forgot I had that cohabitation point, and I just saved it, and then I moved to the next slide, and then in the kind of metadata of the file, there's like this mess up, right? Because there's a part that didn't get presented, and it just almost always ends up with some kind of glitch. So just keep that in mind, because I know some of you are really interested in becoming experts at video creation, and I think that like you really can with PowerPoint. It's really a powerful tool, but you have to be careful because it has kind of predictable hiccups. Okay, great, Mike. Get to the slide. So just as families evolve, so do the interpersonal relationships that are at the heart of family life. And common challenges faced by single adults are like, and again, I understand that like this is probably referring to a lot of you. Like you're in this scenario, say you're 20 years old away at college or university, and it's like you're trying to figure out, maybe you're dating for the first time, or probably not the first time, but maybe seriously for the first time, or maybe living with someone for the first time. Right, and maybe in this scenario dealing with loneliness if you're not, right, trying to, it says finding a niche in society that's marriage oriented. You could change that to make it more 2022 relevant, to say like finding a niche in a society that's like almost completely online and in and out of different levels of lockdown or closures or whatever word you want to use, right? So it's like that obviously would affect dating, right? And you could probably tell me lots of interesting stories and examples of how that's the case, right? And as a little bit of a heads up, the next big assignment is going to be focusing on the ideas around identity and intimacy. And I am interested, I'm not like, oh, tell me all your, like, I don't want like dating gossip or whatever, but what I'm talking about, obviously you obviously know I didn't mean that. What I mean is like, what is it like trying to go through this stage of life where you're trying to establish who you are socially during one of the most unique social periods in history, easily, right? Cohabitating or cohabituation, or just I'll take a third swing at that, cohabitation, or just basically living with someone else, and when it's a sexual relationship that's not marriage, right? So it's kind of like specifically not a roommate and not a marriage situation. Just to kind of touch back on that last slide, I made the point that it's not just roommates, because to consider this word cohabitating, we usually mean that it's like a dating relationship, right? Because you could kind of say you're cohabiting with like your friend if you're living in an apartment and you're both co-living there, cohabitating. But just, I think the distinction might not be important, but just to make it. So one of the biggest things that affects relationship quality and duration and ability to withstand stuff is like the ability of the people in the relationship to manage conflict, right? Because it's not the ability, notice how that doesn't say like the ability to avoid all conflict, and although that is a typecast. So it's this idea of like a validating would be if I'm like, I tell some story and someone's like, yeah, that's kind of like my experience. Someone else is like, yeah, that sounds like, it's like they're all validating it, right? They're like kind of supporting it. And this is like, here's a good one. If you're interested in a good long-term relationship, it's like you have a fight with your boyfriend or girlfriend and you argue about something, and then there's a bit of a pause. And then they're like, so do you want to watch an episode of Dexter or something? And you like, jump back at that comment. It's like, be careful about doing that, because sometimes people don't know what to say and they're trying to offer back into, it's almost like a poorly delivered peace offering. And I don't know, couples that constantly shut down the other person's attempt to reestablish connection, that's a bad sign. So validating couples, or couples where it's like they build each other up a bit more, often have disagreements, but they don't tend to escalate quite as much. And often that's because even though there's an argument or a fight happening, it's like there's an underlying amount of respect and listening happening, right? Or you can have couples that would be classified more as volatile, and you think of that as like a chemistry experiment where you have like one chemical in a test tube and then you pour in something else and it creates this reaction. It's a volatile, explosive reaction. It's like these would be couples where there's a lot of arguing, not a lot of listening, and there's a lot of negative. But sometimes these can be successful couples if there is a lot of kind of counterbalance, whether it's through a lot of intimacy or a lot of laughter and affection and stuff like that. So the good times can outweigh bad times. Where we tend to see more issues is in avoidant couples, where conflicts are constantly minimized, this kind of like agreeing to disagree, which sort of devitalizes, or kind of another way of saying that is sucks the energy out of the relationship. Right? It's like that age-old idea of like you have to deal with the little dragons while they're little dragons, or else they'll become big dragons. I think that's St. George that said that, but I'm not sure. Okay, so couples most likely to divorce are going to be couples where you see this kind of really intense arguing. So I have it there as like hostile engaged. So that means like fighting and like keep going at each other. Like they're not like stonewalling each other and detached, which is the next one down. But this one is like, it's just constant fighting, constant arguing. It's like frequent hot arguments with no balancing forces. There's not an active, engaged kind of intimate sexual life. There's maybe not like humor. Maybe there's not a lot of positive. Maybe there's not a lot of like positive dinners or experiences or just anything else that can kind of balance the bad. Or when that regular fighting kind of leads to a situation where they stop making eye contact and start, what the word is stonewalling, or it's like you're talking to a stone wall. And earlier in this presentation, when I talked about that study that I was trying to remember about doctors, it's like that's the same idea. We know that divorce is associated with a bunch of different problematic things, right? Like, and this, if you look at like how it would be related to things like automobile accidents, is like, well, just think about like how distracting and worrying about stuff all the time, and like not being as focused, and maybe being more tired because you're running around more. It's kind of interesting how it would be related specifically to automobile accidents. You know, lost days of work, depression, suicide, those are a little bit more easy to understand as emotional, extreme, negative reactions, sort of. Obviously, lost days from work is very different than suicide, but right? So it's like human beings, just, and one of the reasons why it's like so, any of this stuff is so tough, right? And earlier in the first part of the course in the fall, we talked about divorce, but we were talking more about how it affected the kids, and here I'm talking a little bit more about how it affects like the adult, right? And it's such like a shattering of your kind of interpretive way of making sense of your experience. And it depends too, right? Like if it was a long time coming, or if it's relative shock, or what the reason was, obviously affects it. And so I want to touch on a couple other kind of relevant developmental points related to this time period in life. So I'm going to move on a tiny bit from the specific talk about marriage and relationships and stuff like that, and talk about some women after they give birth experience something called postpartum depression, and it's a very specific type of depression that's caused by some of the factors related to pregnancy. And we think that some of it is biological, and we think that because we know that, for example, if a woman is exposed to a lot of steroid for medical reasons during pregnancy, that seems to have an effect. And we also know that like the stress level of mom before, and if mom goes into the pregnancy process depressed or into the delivery process depressed, that basically depression before pregnancy is the best predictor of postpartum depression. So we know that there's both sort of like life variables and biological variables. It's nature nurture, but it's this complicated thing. And I can just tell you, because I've recently my wife's recently delivered a child, and at the place they like have pamphlets about it that they were giving me, and it's like they're trying to be really aware of, and have the partner in those scenarios be like really aware of signs to look for, is like early warning signals and stuff. I'm going to just talk a bit about this. So postpartum depression, and that bottom point in yellow, right, that actually depression during pregnancy is the best predictor of women that will experience postpartum depression. And that's kind of obvious, that, or not, maybe not obvious, but it's logical at least, that if somebody's dealing with that difficulty in their experience of mood, and then they have this major biological experience, that those two things would influence each other, or that the biological experience would potentially be linked to this development of this specific profound sadness that tends to be experienced for several weeks after birth. And yeah, and I kind of made some of these points out of order, but that women who have a lot of steroid use during pregnancy, usually for injuries or for other reasons, it's for medical reasons, that we see that has an impact, which is interesting, right? Because that's like a very biochemical aspect. And then if we say like unplanned pregnancies makes it more likely, that's interesting, because that's very much like a nurture environmental situation. And kind of like if mom was less kind of maybe mentally prepared or life prepared, or whatever unplanned would mean, that would add the likelihood of having, you know, negative emotionality. You could at least see how that would, the logic, how you would make that argument. Major life stress is sort of the same. So some of these are nature and some of these are nurture sources of influence. This affects like up to 25% of moms. So if you think about that, it's like that some stats and some reports are as high as 1 out of 4. So that's a huge, huge thing. As people get older, you know, you start to see a decline in risk-taking behavior, and that's pretty much across the board. Want to know something interesting? And I might have already said this to you, but I just want to say this because this is something I found pretty interesting, and it's a kind of recent finding, that because there's always been this saying that like teenagers drive so dangerously because they're like showing off to their friends and stuff, and interesting research shows that actually teenagers and adults drive about the same unless there's friends in the car, which is so interesting because that's sort of always been just like the common saying. And it's interesting when research findings kind of back that up, that really the difference is when there's people watching. So yeah, so anyway, so we see this sensation and decline in risky behaviors. Marital satisfaction tends to decline and remain low until the child leaves house. So this is interesting, right? That oftentimes, and I've talked about this before, but that when couples have kids, oftentimes their life satisfaction that they report goes up, but their marriage satisfaction goes down. And I made the point before in a different lecture about how one of the reasons for that is because, well, just think about it, right? Like if before the kid you're like going on dates a lot, and it's like much more of like almost like a more regularized dating situation, and then all of a sudden, which is not just that, but and then all of a sudden you have a kid, and all of a sudden there's so much like shared responsibility and coordinating, and you're going to do this and this, and then you do this, and then you had 2 kids, and it's like basically you're like co-workers almost, and it's like, so you can see how that would affect. So yeah, division of labor issues, so like who's going to do what, especially in the middle of the night, and it's the third dirty diaper, and you're so desperate to sleep. Support from extended family can really help, and the better couples are at kind of conflict strategy, and like you hear couples have good rules, right? Like a good rule when you have a kid is like if you accidentally say like a mean thing to each other like after 3 in the morning, it doesn't count, because like that's oftentimes when you're exhausted, you've been woken up 4 times, you really want the other person to do it. It's like, yeah, so anyways, it's just anyone that has kids can probably relate to what I'm saying, but the better you are at kind of understanding and contextualizing it and realizing that, like, you're not arguing because you don't like the other person. A lot of times it's just a stressful pressure that's on you that you're both trying to figure out as best as you can. Right? And that's talking about if there's two, and it's like hard enough with two, and that's kind of why this point here of like there tends to be even more of a reported drop in life satisfaction amongst single parents, because everything I just said now it's one person doing. Right? And especially if they don't have a lot of family support, that can be incredibly demanding, one of the most demanding things. So look at this. This is for like someone like me, a kind of depressing chart, but along the left there it says percentage of couples reporting that things between them are going well all the time, in quotes. It's like before marriage it's like 30%. You know, when you have kids it drops down to as low as 10%, and then after retirement it gets as high as like 40%. Right? So now again, that's a loaded question, that your relationship's going well all the time. But it is at least interesting. Rapid fire quiz review time, my friends. This is where I just quickly kind of overview what we talked about to prep you up for the test. The first 20 years are important in predicting an adult's personality, but so are the ongoing experiences in the adult years. Attachment styles, for example, reflect childhood patterns and continue to influence relationships in adulthood. Adult attachments are categorized as secure, avoidant, or anxious, and we talked about that. A secure attachment style is linked with positive aspects of relationships. Costa and McCrae's Big Five personality traits include things like openness, or not things like, specifically openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, sometimes now called emotional stability, although I'm using their language because that's the original model. Erickson theorized that intimacy versus isolation is the key developmental issue in early adulthood. Friendship plays an important role in adult development, especially in terms of emotional support. Romantic love, sometimes called passionate love, includes passion and sexuality with a mixture of emotions, not all of which are positive. Affectionate love, also called companionate love, can become more important as relationships mature, right? And it's like, I don't know if I even directly said that, but just this idea of like, as you be with someone for a long time and you kind of move out of the classic kind of Hollywood honeymoon phase, it's like that ability to have emotional connection. And, you know, I used the term earlier in the presentation, deep friendship becomes important. Sternberg proposed this triactic or three-part model of love: passion, intimacy, and commitment. If all three qualities are present, the result is what he called consummate or complete love. Okay, so the last point I want to make, Gottman's research indicates that couples in successful marriages establish love maps, nurture fondness and admiration, turn towards each other, accept the influence of the partner, and create shared meanings together. And then he said that from his research that this is kind of characteristic of successful long-term partnerships. All right, we're at the end of chapter 10. I want to thank you again. This was, I made some weird points at different parts of this, but I think, you know, I was trying to be really honest at this presentation and kind of try to address this idea of like what it's like to try to establish relationships of depth and value at this key developmental stage. So anyways, I want to end this with a video that's kind of a classic, and this is some classic footage of the great Dr. Viktor Frankl. See you next time.
In your work, you quote Nietzsche quite a bit. His line, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." What do you think he meant by that?
What I think,
What do you think he meant by that?
the same as I am intended to convey to my readers and students, that the vision of a meaning ahead of someone, a meaning in wait for someone, to be fulfilled by someone, that this contributes most than anything else under equal other circumstances for survival.
Meaning is the most important thing in our lives?
Certainly, because what I call a will to meaning, the wish to find and to fulfill meaning, is the basic motivation in human beings.
Well, this certainly runs counter to much of the determinist notions that are being bandied around these days, as man is a machine, man is a computer, man is a product of instincts.
Man is something like a rat in experiments, psychological experiments. Of course, you're right, but not only against the so-called deterministic concepts of man, but also regarding the motivational theories of certain psychotherapeutic systems.
Let's talk for a minute about logotherapy, which arose out of this notion of a search for meaning.
Logotherapy, as one among other types of psychotherapy, is, we may say, a meaning-centered psychotherapy. Inasmuch particularly as logotherapy sees a human being not predominantly determined, not to say dominated, by the will to pleasure, as you were mentioning, nor by the will to power along the lines of Adlerian teachings, but basically, fundamentally, by a will to meaning. That is to say, the desire, the impulse to find, to discover in life, or better to say in each life situation, concrete life situation, confronting someone, the desire to find a meaning therein and to go on to fulfill it.
I was very intrigued. One of the most surprising things I've read recently was that you said that when you talked to European students, only 40% said they had suffered this sort of inner void, and yet 81% of American students experience the same thing.
This was decades ago.
We think of it just the opposite. We think of the Europeans as being buried under this existential dread and sense of purposelessness, and Americans as being optimistic and upbeat.
However it might be, whether the ones or the others are suffering more or less respectively from this existential vacuum. The ones who seem to suffer less should not look at the others with contempt, but look at the others with compassion and look for anything possible to help the others.
Now this void manifests itself as
in apathy, in boredom, lack of initiative, lack of interest in the world, or initiative in changing something within the world for the better. This frustration is a proof of the existence of a will to meaning. Unless we were imbued by will to meaning, by the wish to find meaning and discover and fulfill meaning in life, we never would be able to experience an inner void. So this is in a way also something positive.
Now you've listed 3 types of values: creative values, experiential values, and attitudinal values.
And you may find a meaning. The average man, the man on the street or the woman on the street, may find a meaning day by day in doing a deed, in creating a work. And
that's the creative.
And in experiencing something, the beauty, the truth as a researcher, or the good in dealing with people as a teacher or whatsoever.
There's an extraordinary moment in Man's Search for Meaning where you talk about being in one of the Nazi camps and all of you going out to look at a sunset. Is that
exactly? This is a paradigm of experiential values, of finding a meaning in experiencing without doing anything, without achieving or accomplishing anything, but just in giving oneself to the immediate experience of something, say, beautiful going on in the world. Okay. This is the second avenue. But there is also another aspect of experiential values. Excuse me, not only experiencing something, but also experiencing someone. More than that, experiencing another human being in his or her very uniqueness. And it is the main attribute of a human being that he is a person in contrast to any animal. He is a person, and a person is always something absolutely unique, irrepeatable in the evolution of the cosmos, as it were, incomparable with any other human being. And this uniqueness can be got hold of solely by a loving person, because he not only sees the essence, but also the potentials in the beloved person, thereby, as I put it before, promoting him, alleviating it to reach out to attain this potential and to fulfill and thereby actualize also himself, but not by preaching self-actualization. It's nonsense. Self-actualization can only fall into your lap automatically once that you have fulfilled a concrete meaning, done the best of a situation. Then you actualize yourself as a byproduct.
Let's talk about the third set of values, which is the attitudinal, the idea of choosing how to respond to suffering.
Choosing the attitude.
Yes.
Yeah. If there is no possibility in a given situation to fulfill the meaning of a situation by giving oneself to the experience of beauty and so forth, nor to, if you have lost the capability to do your job, to do your work, even then there is an ultimate possibility to find and fulfill meaning. Not only the ultimate, it is even the potential to fulfill the deepest meaning, to attain the highest values. By your approach to the situation, a tragic or triste situation confronting you.
You said that in part of the initial shock of being put in a death camp was ultimately an acceptance that we knew we had nothing to lose except our ridiculously naked lives. Is that the situation that they're in?
In a way.
Is this when you make the choice of how you're going to? Your last value choice is how to react to the situation.
You stood there naked, with nothing you could have had, but all the more what counted and mattered was what you were, being rather than having, possessing anything, or the being. So what counted was what you make out of this situation, with what attitude you adopt in the given situation. And there is a multitude, a wealth of possible attitudes to how to approach it. So we have to decide.
The ultimate, I would take it, attitudinal value challenge that we all share is how we're going to face death. How do you prepare people for that? How do you prepare yourself for that?
I couldn't prepare anyone else unless I would have prepared myself. Because if you are a psychiatrist, your patients feel exactly whether or not you are really convinced of what you are teaching and telling them. Now, I'm convinced that in contrast to the usual aspect, the albeit sound aspect to life, and more specifically to the past, to life's transitoriness, and this includes that we approach, each of us are approaching death. In contrast to that, I maintain that in the past, nothing is lost, but right on the contrary, everything is stored forever. It is not annihilated by transitoriness, but on the contrary, it is becoming preserved forever. Something you have done can never be undone. Something you have experienced, something you have even experienced in a negative sense, going through suffering, And if you have, for instance, if you have suffered, gone through this suffering, honestly, courageously, and with dignity, who in the world, what in the world can deny, can annihilate this? What you have done has been done forever, in both ways, in a negative as in a positive way. It cannot be undone. And the past is a storehouse of what you have done, what you have experienced, what you have gone through, and what you have done out of all the negative and tragic aspects as even encountered within your life.
I want to thank you for being on the show. And I want to thank you at home for watching.